All right, we're continuing on with Reconstruction today, guys. So what we're going to be doing now will help you fill out your chart for the rights that African Americans gain after Reconstruction. So let's dive in, or during Reconstruction. So Lincoln and Congress disagree about the 50% plan versus the 10% plan, but what they can agree on is that former slaves, known as freedmen in the South, need help. They can't just integrate into society perfectly. So a government organization called the Freedmen's Bureau was established in March 1865, right when the war ends, and it is government help and services for newly freed slaves in the South. So schools, teaching them how to read and write, help finding jobs, labor contracts, lawyers, legal counsel, those sort of things. And so the North, the government dispatched people to the South to work for the Freedmen's Bureau and help these African Americans. Their goal was to kind of oversee their integration into society and help them navigate. You were once a slave, now here's what it looks like to be a freedman. And it was a difficult job because they faced a lot of harassment from white Southerners, from the KKK and the White League, and we'll get to those in a second. One other thing they also help them do is register to vote, so write that down for me. Because eventually they will get the right to vote. So on April 14th and 15th, sorry, the picture got pretty grainy, Lincoln and his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, go to see a show called Our American Cousin. It's a comedy show, and they're sitting up in the presidential box of Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., and you can go visit it today. And a man named John Wilkes Booth, who was an actor, not in the show being performed, but there, and who was a Confederate sympathizer, meaning that he didn't like how the war ended. He wanted the Confederacy to win, and he was trying to ensure that would happen during the war. Got through security and entered Lincoln's box. He knew when the laughing was going to happen in the show. He fired his shot then. He jumped down onto the stage, said the word Sic Semper Tyrannis. That means thus always to tyrants, calling Lincoln a tyrant. And then he said the South is avenged. And he ran away. He was caught. They burned down a barn. Trying to find him. He died. All his sympathizers, people that helped him carry out this plot, were found and hung, including a woman. Abraham Lincoln himself, it took him all night to die. They took his body across the street to a professional's house. He was a doctor, and he laid in that bed, and he died the next morning on April 15th. And now our nation is in ruins. The North and South are not put back together, and the president is dead. And when the president dies, the vice president becomes president. So here is Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson is sworn in the next day after Lincoln's death, and he is very different. He is actually not a Republican at all like Lincoln. He is a Democrat. Now, why did Lincoln have a Democrat Southern vice president? The goal was to try and bring everyone together and include all opinions to make the South feel like they're actually honored. So Johnson comes in and he's like, this whole Reconstruction thing that Lincoln was doing, I'm not going to do it that way. So here is Johnson's plan. So Johnson's Reconstruction plan is quite a bit different. So he still has the oath. The oath has to be taken. I'm loyal to the Union. We will emancipate slavery, except some people will not be pardoned. Wealthy landowners and military leadership will not be pardoned. And the reason that he's kind of against those people, and he's a lot harsher, even though he is a Southerner, is Johnson was a poor Southerner. And so he always had this vendetta against the rich, wealthy landowners, okay? He said that slavery must be abolished for a state to gain readmittance. That's the same. States must repeal their secession, meet together and say it was wrong for us to do that. He said that confiscated land the Union had gone through and confiscated Confederate holdings should be redistributed to owners of the land if they had been pardoned, not freedmen. So there was an idea at the time that every slave, the owner, their former master's land should be cut up and divided amongst the slaves. And he said, no, that's not the case. It should be given back to those that owned it. And the one thing that was really, really different here is he wanted to allow Southern governance governments to form on their own and then rejoin the Union, meaning that they have a lot more leniency. They have a lot more power to do what they want and not so much what the federal government wants them to do. So there are problems here. Congress said, you haven't really helped out freedmen. I don't see Freedmen's Bureau in here. You're not giving them land. You're not giving them education or any help. They're just going to go back into this really low class, discriminated against form of life that they were once in. They didn't like that state governments were left on their own after readmittance, because if no one's watching over them, what are they going to do? Are they going to make it really bad for African Americans? They said that state governments could not have slavery, but enacted black codes. So in this scenario where the federal government really doesn't help out in the South, yeah, they can outlaw slavery, but then they can make other laws that really suck for African Americans. And that's exactly what they do. They're called black codes, and it basically are laws that only apply to people of color. And they're laws that will keep them in a dependent position. And we'll look at those in just a second. So for an example, you have to have a labor contract. That contract is for a certain number of years. You have to work for that person. There's no freedom. You can't get out of it. You can't just quit a job because you want to quit a job. So basically trying to make them in a position of slavery, even though slavery is outlawed. And because the federal government isn't in the South watching these governments and watching over the freedmen, radical groups like the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan emerge that are meant to intimidate and instill fear in African Americans. So here's an example of a labor contract of a black code. I'll let you pause the video and read that. Here's another example of black codes. I'll let you pause the video and then read through it. And it is, again, meant to be very strict and keep freedmen, African Americans who are no longer slaves, in a position of dependency with very strict rules, much like slavery. So because these congressmen really hate Johnson and hate his ideas, they put forth a new plan where Johnson has no power, and they're going to try and get Johnson impeached, actually. So radical Republicans is a portion of the Republican Party that forms during this time, because they are forming an opposition to Johnson, saying that he's not doing enough to protect, had to sneeze, to protect African Americans, to protect, to ensure that the state governments that are forming in the South are actually conducive to integrating African Americans into life. So the plan wasn't tough enough. They say it needs to be tougher on the South and needs to protect African Americans more. So they come together in the hopes to reshape Southern society, give freedmen political and economic equality. They don't like the black codes. They don't like that Johnson's not doing anything about what's happening in the Southern states. And so they make a few actions here. One is the Civil Rights Act of 1866, and that gives legal rights and citizenships to African Americans. And that will eventually make it into the 14th Amendment. So it's easy to overturn a law in our government. So oftentimes amendments will start as bills, start as laws that go through Congress, and then they'll try and make it into an amendment because it's so much harder to overturn an amendment. You have to create a new amendment to overturn an amendment. So the Civil Rights Act of 1866 is a precursor to the 14th Amendment. They push forth a bill to support the Freedmen's Bureau and continue to financially support it and send Freedmen's Bureau agents to the South. And both of those easily pass Congress over Johnson's veto. So they pass through Congress, he vetoes it, then it goes back to Congress, and a 2/3 majority, which is called a supermajority, can override a veto, and that's exactly what happened. Okay? However, it didn't really solve the problem. There's still going to be discrimination. So these Republicans come together and they devise this plan. First of all, we're going to give African Americans more rights. We're going to change Reconstruction. We're going to get rid of Andrew Johnson because they didn't like him. So this is basically what I've just summarized to you. Here's their plan. They're able to overturn Johnson's vetoes no matter what. So no matter what they push through, if he vetoes it, they're going to overturn it. Boom, it's done. So they have all the power, essentially. They pass the 14th Amendment. Like I said, they take that Civil Rights Act of 1866 and make it into an amendment, so it's harder to overturn. And it gives citizenship to all persons born in the United States. So that includes freedmen. So it gives freedmen citizenship, okay? The Reconstruction Acts are a series of acts, part of their plan to take over Reconstruction. Goodbye, Johnson's plan for Reconstruction. This is the way it is. And here's what they do. They divide the South into 5 military districts. And we'll look at a picture of that in class. So 5 different places that the military will be in charge of. And they literally send the U.S. military, the Union Army, what's left of it, down to the South to, like, watch over them, kind of like we're watching you. They set readmission regulations. So if you wanted to join the Union as a state again, you had to ratify, first of all, you had to get rid of slavery. You had to ratify the 14th Amendment. You had to write a new state constitution that guarantees freedmen the right to vote. And you had to form a new government elected by all male citizens, including African Americans or black citizens. Okay? So with the government watching over, with the federal government watching over these states, it was so much more strict. They had to include all these things, and their state government was always being watched over. The final thing they do is devise this trap for Andrew Johnson to get him fired. It's called the Tenure of Office Act of 1867. You don't need to remember that. All you need to know is it's a trap. Basically, it requires Senate approval to remove any official whose appointment had been approved. So if you're part of the cabinet, then your appointment has to be approved by the Senate. And they say if you get fired, that has to be approved too. And this is a trap for Andrew Johnson because Andrew Johnson really hates this guy named Edwin Stanton and wants to fire him. And so Congress passes this bill so that Andrew Johnson will fire him, and then they can say Andrew Johnson broke the law, he needs to be impeached. And that's exactly what happened. So he tested the law, he fired Edwin Stanton, Congress holds an impeachment trial, they vote to impeach him for violating the law, but he was not convicted. So he fell 1 vote short of the 2/3 majority needed to convict. And at this point, he's only got 3 or 4 months left in his presidency, and he just sits there and does nothing. So he was impeached, but he wasn't convicted and removed. The conviction and removal did not get all the votes that it needed. So Congress, with this sitting duck lame president not really doing anything, has all the power because they have this big supermajority in Congress. And so they pass another round of things. They nominate a Republican candidate, and he wins over Johnson for the presidency. So Johnson took over for what was left of Lincoln's presidency, which was basically the whole 4 years. He had just been elected when he died. And then when a new election comes up, he loses. And Ulysses S. Grant, who was a Union military officer, a Union general, is elected. And he wins the presidency. He's a Republican. The radical Republicans get along with him. And he passes the 15th Amendment, which gave voting rights to African Americans. Well, all the states ratify the 15th Amendment. So let's take a look at these responses then, because things are really, really changing with Congress completely in charge of Reconstruction. There are 2 groups of people in the South, 2 important groups causing major changes. They've got funny names too. The scallywags, sometimes called scoundrels, were white Southerners who supported Reconstruction. And they helped the Freedmen's Bureau. They supported the military, helped the military take control of these state governments. They were hated by a lot of white Southerners. And then the carpetbaggers. Carpetbaggers were Northerners who came down to the South to help in the changes, and they were called carpetbaggers because the type of suitcase back then kind of looked like a fancy rug, a carpet. And so they would come down to the South with their fancy suitcases. So the Northerners who came to the South to help in the changes, maybe they worked in the Freedmen's Bureau, or they were Northerners who were put in charge of kind of like watching over the Southern state governments, okay? So in military Reconstruction, good things happen until military Reconstruction ends. But the good things that happen are 700 African Americans serve in state legislatures. We get 16 blacks elected to federal Congress from southern states. We get a school system for African Americans to go to school for free, to learn how to read and write. It eliminated property requirements for voting and holding office, meaning anyone can vote, anyone can hold office. A lot of state governments made laws that made it illegal to discriminate, and black codes were repealed, and all of this lasts for not that long. So from 1868-ish to 1876 is when military Reconstruction lasts, and these good things have time, and the blacks are protected in the South, and they're able to be involved in social, economic, and political life. And then Reconstruction is going to come to an end, and that will not be the case anymore. So before Reconstruction ends, though, white Southerners devise a way to still discriminate against African Americans, and it's called sharecropping and tenant farming. So sharecropping, tenant farming, they're very, very similar. But basically, sharecropping is the idea of, instead of paying people in money, you pay them in the crop that they get. So basically, the landowner, the former white master, provides the land, the seed, the tools, the mule, a cabin, maybe some food, and the sharecropper provides the labor, and then the money that they make on crops or the crops themselves is their payment, and then they can go try and sell it at the market. So essentially, it's kind of like a form of slavery. Tenant farming is the same. It required renting land from the owner and allowed freedom to choose which crops to grow, but you had to have money to start. So most African Americans don't become tenant farmers because they can't pay rent. They become sharecroppers, where they live on the land, they work the land, they get paid in crops, and then they take those crops and try and sell them at the market for money. They're not paid wages. So what if there's a giant thunderstorm and a hailstorm and your crop is destroyed? Well, all of a sudden you're in debt to the landowner who provided you land, seed, tools, a mule, cabin, food, but you don't have any crops to pay them with. Next year you got to work to pay them back, and for the current year. So it's a system of slavery with a different name. And it wasn't just African Americans who sharecropped, but it was mostly African Americans. All right.